long before the great war that would end an age, before brothers faced each other across the battlefield of Kurukshetra. The seeds of destiny were planted in the royal house of Hastinapura. This is where our tale begins, not with the clash of armies, but with the choices of individuals whose personal struggles would reshape the very foundations of Dharma itself. The Kuru dynasty had ruled the fertile plains of northern Bharatavarsha for generations, their capital city of Hastinapura standing proud beside the sacred Ganga. Yet for all their power and prosperity, the royal house carried within it the burden of impossible choices and sacred vows that would echo through the generations, like the reverberations of a struck bell. Among the princes of this ancient line, none was more noble or more tragic than the one who would come to be known as Bhishma. Born as Devavrata to Shantanu and the river goddess Ganga herself, he possessed strength that could humble gods and wisdom that could illuminate the darkest moral complexities. His very name meant one who takes a terrible vow, though that destiny lay hidden in the future when he first drew breath. Shantanu ruled with justice and compassion, beloved by his subjects and favored by the gods. The monarch had known celestial love. His marriage to Ganga had blessed him with 8 sons, though 7 had been taken by the river goddess immediately after birth, leaving only Devavrata. The boy grew into a warrior without peer, trained by the greatest masters, versed in every branch of knowledge, seemingly destined to inherit a glorious throne. But the heart wants what it wants, and even rulers are not immune to love's sudden arrows. During a hunting expedition along the Yamuna's banks, Shantanu encountered Satyavati, daughter of a fisherman, whose beauty struck him like lightning from a clear sky. Her dark eyes held depths that rivaled the sacred rivers, and her grace moved with the rhythm of the eternal dance. The sovereign, though advanced in years, found himself utterly captivated. Yet when Shantanu approached her sire seeking her hand, he met with an unexpected condition. The fisherman, though humble in station, understood the value of what he possessed. "Great monarch," he said, "my daughter's beauty is matched only by her virtue. But if she is to become your queen, her son must inherit your throne. I will not see her children made subordinate to any other." The demand pierced Shantanu's heart like a spear. How could he disinherit Devavrata, his beloved son, fruit of celestial union, heir to generations of royal blood? Yet how could he abandon this love that had awakened in him a joy he thought lost forever? Torn between duty and desire, the ruler retreated to his palace, falling into a melancholy so profound that the very flowers in his garden seemed to wilt in sympathy. Devavrata, observing his parents' decline with growing alarm, pressed until the truth emerged. When he learned of the fisherman's condition, the prince felt the weight of an impossible choice settling upon his shoulders like a mountain. Here was the man who had given him life, love, and every opportunity to flourish, now withering away for want of happiness. Here was his own birthright, earned through lineage and merit, the crown that represented duty to the kingdom and the ancestors. What followed would be remembered as one of the most selfless acts in the annals of human history. Devavrata sought out the fisherman and, in the presence of gods and men, made not one vow, but 2. First, he renounced all claim to the throne of Hastinapura, declaring that Satyavati's sons would rule after Shantanu. But the fisherman, his mind sharp as any courtier's, raised another concern. What if your children, mighty prince, contest this arrangement in future generations? Without hesitation, Devavrata made a second vow, one so shocking that the very heavens shook and flowers rained from the skies. I swear by all that is sacred that I shall never marry, never father children, never know the touch of a woman or the joy of offspring. My lineage ends with me, so that no child of mine may ever challenge the rightful heirs." The gods themselves trembled at this pronouncement, and from that moment Devavrata became Bhishma, he of the terrible vow. His sacrifice secured his sire's happiness, but doomed him to a life without the consolations of family, forever bound to serve a throne he could never claim. Shantanu's marriage to Satyavati brought him 2 sons, Chitrangada and Vichitravirya, but joy in the royal house proved as transient as morning dew. Chitrangada, though brave and noble, died young in battle, leaving the succession to his younger brother. Vichitravirya, handsome and well-meaning, lacked the strength of character that kingship demanded. More troubling still, he died without producing an heir, leaving the dynasty facing extinction. In this crisis, Satyavati revealed a secret that would reshape the royal lineage forever. Before her marriage to Shantanu, she had borne a son to the sage Parashara, a child named Krishna Dvaipayana, later known as Vyasa, the compiler of the Vedas and the very narrator of this tale. Born of a union between mortal woman and celestial sage, Vyasa possessed powers that transcended ordinary human limitations. By the ancient law of Niyoga, when a monarch died without issue, a suitable male relative could sire children on the widows to continue the line. Though unusual, this practice ensured dynastic survival in desperate times. Satyavati called upon her firstborn son to fulfill this sacred duty, and Vyasa, dark-skinned and terrible in his ascetic power, agreed to beget children on Vichitravirya's widows. What followed were births that would determine the fate of the world. When Vyasa approached Ambika, the elder queen, she was so terrified by his fearsome appearance that she closed her eyes throughout their union. Her son, born blind, was named Dhritarashtra, he whose kingdom is held firmly. Despite his blindness, the child possessed the strength of 10,000 elephants and a mind sharp as any blade. The younger queen, Ambalika, though she kept her eyes open, grew pale with fear during her encounter with the sage. Her son, born with the pallor of fear still marking his skin, was named the Pale One. Yet what he lacked in coloring, he made up for in other virtues. He became a mighty archer, a just ruler, and a conqueror of kingdoms. Satyavati, concerned about the circumstances of these births, convinced the queens to summon Vyasa once more. But when the time came, Ambika, still traumatized by her previous experience, sent her maid in her place. This serving woman, neither royal nor afraid, received the sage with proper respect and reverence. Her son, born dark like his sire but brilliant in wisdom, was named Vidura. Though born of a servant, his insight and counsel would prove invaluable to the royal house. Thus were born the 3 pillars of the next generation. Dhritarashtra, the strong but blind, the pale prince, just but cursed, and Vidura, the wise but humble. Their strange births foreshadowed the complex moral landscape they would navigate, where blindness could be both literal and metaphorical, where strength might mask weakness, and where wisdom often emerged from the most unexpected sources. As the brothers matured, their contrasting natures became clear. Dhritarashtra, despite his noble heart, allowed his blindness to become a metaphor for his moral vision. He loved too deeply and saw too little. The Pale Prince emerged as the natural leader, his justice and military prowess making him the obvious choice for ruler, despite being younger than his blind brother. Vidura, though ineligible for the throne due to his birth, became the kingdom's conscience, offering counsel that was always wise and rarely welcome. The Pale One's reign brought prosperity and expansion to the Kuru kingdom. His conquests extended the realm's borders, while his just rule earned the love of his subjects. He married twice, first to Kunti, a princess of extraordinary beauty and virtue, and later to Madri, a princess of the Madra kingdom whose grace was matched only by her devotion. But prosperity bred complacency, and complacency led to catastrophe. During a hunting expedition in the forests, the monarch encountered a sage engaged in intimate union with his wife, having taken the forms of deer for privacy. The ruler, seeing only the deer and not recognizing the celestial nature of the beings, shot the male with his arrow. As the sage lay dying, he cursed his slayer with the very fate he had just inflicted. As you have destroyed me in the moment of love, so too shall you die if you ever approach your wives with desire. The curse struck the pale prince like a physical blow. A monarch without heirs was no ruler at all, and the very touch he most craved from his beloved wives was forbidden to him on pain of death. In despair, he abdicated the throne in favor of his brother Dhritarashtra and retreated to the forest with his wives, seeking through penance and meditation some release from his terrible fate. Yet even in exile, the gods were not finished with the house of Kuru. Kunti possessed a secret that would prove to be the dynasty's salvation. Years before her marriage, while still a young princess serving in her household, she had shown such devoted hospitality to the sage Durvasa that he had granted her a powerful boon, a mantra that could summon any god to beget a child upon her. In her youth and curiosity, Kunti had tested this gift, calling upon Surya, the sun god himself. The deity had appeared in all his blazing glory, and despite her protests that she had merely been testing the mantra, he declared that a god's blessing, once invoked, could not be withdrawn. The result was a child born celestial, beautiful, invincible, adorned with natural armor and earrings that were part of his very flesh. But Kunti was an unmarried princess, and the shame of bearing a child outside wedlock would have destroyed her family's honor. With breaking heart, she placed the infant in a basket and set him adrift on the river, praying to all the gods for his protection. The child was found and raised by Adhiratha, a charioteer, and his wife Radha, who named him Karna, the one adorned with earrings. Now, faced with her husband's curse and the kingdom's need for heirs, Kunti revealed her secret. With the pale prince's blessing, she began invoking the gods to beget children who would inherit their celestial sire's qualities while remaining legally his sons. First came Yudhishthira, son of Dharma himself, the god of justice, a child destined to be truth incarnate, but burdened with the weight of absolute moral responsibility. Next was Bhima, son of Vayu, the wind god, born with strength that rivaled his celestial sire's tempests. Even as an infant, his power was evident. When he accidentally fell from Kunti's lap onto a rocky outcrop, the stone shattered while the child remained unharmed, laughing at what others would have considered certain death. The third son, Arjuna, was born to Indra, sovereign of the gods and lord of thunder. From birth, he was marked for greatness as a warrior, his progenitor's own prowess with celestial weapons flowing in his veins. But more than martial skill, Arjuna inherited Indra's complex nature, capable of supreme focus and devastating doubt, of heavenly glory and human weakness. Madri, seeing the miraculous sons granted to her co-wife, begged to share in this blessing. Kunti, in a moment of generosity that she would later regret, shared the mantra with her. Madri used it to invoke the Ashvins, the celestial twins who were the physicians of the gods. She bore twin sons, Nakula and Sahadeva, beautiful as their heavenly progenitors, and gifted with knowledge of horses and hidden things respectively. These 5 boys, born of gods but raised as brothers, grew up in the forest under their guardian's watchful eye. They learned not just the arts of war and statecraft, but also the deeper lessons of Dharma that only those who had suffered could truly understand. The Pale Prince, though denied the physical love of his wives, found in these celestial children a joy that transcended earthly pleasures. Yet even the most vigilant guard against destiny will eventually falter. After years of ascetic discipline, watching the dawn break over the Himalayan peaks where they had made their home, the exiled monarch felt the weight of his celibacy pressing upon him like a mountain. Madri, his younger wife, moved with such grace that morning, tending the sacred fire as the golden light caught her silhouette. That desire overwhelmed duty. In a moment of weakness that was profoundly human, the Pale One approached his beloved wife. The curse, patient as time itself, struck instantly. Even as they embraced, death claimed the ruler, leaving Madri to bear the burden of having been both the object of love and the instrument of doom. Unable to live with the guilt of having caused her husband's death, Madri chose to join him on his funeral pyre, leaving her twin sons to be raised by Kunti. Thus the 5 Pandava brothers, Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva, lost both parents in a single day, inheriting not just celestial heritage, but also the bitter knowledge that love and duty do not always align. Meanwhile, in Hastinapura, Dhritarashtra had ruled as regent, expecting that his brother would eventually return. His own wife, the ambitious Gandhari, had chosen to blindfold herself permanently in sympathy with her husband's condition, a gesture of devotion that was also a mark of the moral blindness that would plague their lineage. When Gandhari learned she was pregnant, jealousy of Kunti's celestial sons led her to seek her own miracle. After an unnaturally long pregnancy of 2 years, Gandhari's womb finally yielded not a child, but a mass of flesh. Vyasa, summoned to deal with this crisis, divided the mass into 101 pieces, each of which grew into a child when placed in vessels of clarified butter. 100 sons and 1 daughter emerged from this strange birth. The Kauravas, led by their eldest, Duryodhana, whose very name meant difficult to conquer. When news of the Pale Prince's death reached the capital, Bhishma himself travelled to the forest to bring the widowed queens and their sons back to the palace. The sight of the 5 boys, noble Yudhishthira, with truth shining in his eyes, powerful Bhima, whose very presence seemed to disturb the air around him, graceful Arjuna, already showing the archer's keen gaze, and the beautiful twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, filled the old regent's heart with both joy and foreboding. These children of gods walked among mortals, but they were still children, still vulnerable to the jealousies and ambitions that plagued human hearts. As their procession approached Hastinapura, the citizens lined the roads, throwing flowers and calling blessings. But in the palace, Duryodhana watched from a high window, his heart already darkening with the resentment that would eventually consume the world. The stage was set for a drama that would span generations. In the halls of Hastinapura, children destined to be heroes and villains played together, unaware that their games were rehearsals for conflicts that would shake the foundations of righteousness itself. The blind sovereign loved all the children as his own, but his blindness extended beyond the physical. He could not see how his favoritism toward his own sons was nurturing the very seeds of destruction. Vidura, ever wise, watched these developments with growing unease. He could see the patterns forming like storm clouds on a clear horizon. The celestial children bore the mark of destiny, while the Kaurava princes, born of strange magic rather than heavenly blessing, seemed driven by earthly ambitions that recognized no limits. Between them stood Dharma itself, no longer a clear path, but a maze of conflicting duties. where every choice led to consequences that no human wisdom could fully foresee. Thus were sown the seeds that would grow into the Great War, in a palace where blind love competed with clear sight, where celestial heritage wrestled with human ambition, and where the very meaning of righteousness would be tested in fires that would either purify or destroy everything they touched. The children played on, innocent of their destiny, while their elders watched and wondered which choices might yet avert the catastrophe that seemed to draw closer with each passing day. The return to Hastinapura marked the beginning of a new chapter in the ancient dynasty's history. Within the palace walls, the 5 sons of gods grew alongside their 100 cousins, their childhood a mixture of play and preparation for the destinies that awaited them. Yet even in these early years, the fault lines that would eventually tear the realm apart were already beginning to show. Bhishma, now serving as the elder statesman of the dynasty, took upon himself the education of all the royal children. The palace became a vast training ground where the arts of war and peace were taught with equal dedication. Masters of every discipline arrived from across the known world to share their knowledge with these young heirs, each carrying within them the potential to reshape the world. The differences between the cousins became apparent almost immediately. The Pandava brothers, marked by their celestial heritage, excelled in ways that transcended ordinary human capability. Yudhishthira absorbed lessons in statecraft and justice with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if the very concept of righteousness flowed in his veins. Bhima's physical training sessions left practice weapons shattered and sparring partners nursing bruises that would last for weeks. The master archer's focus during instruction was so complete that he entered another realm entirely, one where only he and his target existed. The twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, showed aptitudes that reflected their celestial lineage. Nakula possessed an almost supernatural understanding of horses, able to communicate with the animals in ways that amazed even the most experienced stable masters. Sahadeva demonstrated an uncanny ability to perceive hidden truths, often knowing things he had no earthly way of learning. Among the Kaurava brothers, the eldest emerged as their natural leader, not through any supernatural gifts, but through sheer force of personality and an intelligence that was both sharp and cunning. His strength rivaled Bhima's, though it was earned through relentless training rather than inherited from the wind god. More importantly, he possessed a charisma that drew others to his cause, an ability to inspire loyalty that would serve his ambitions well in the years to come. Yet with each passing day, the disparity between the cousins became more pronounced, and with it grew a resentment that no amount of family affection could fully mask. The Kaurava leader watched as praise was heaped upon his cousins for achievements that came to them as naturally as breathing, while his own accomplishments, hard won through effort and determination, appeared to pale in comparison. The first great teacher to arrive in Hastinapura was Kripacharya, a master of weapons who had been found as an infant among the reeds by the river. His knowledge of warfare was comprehensive, but it was his ability to see the character of his students that made him truly valuable. Under his guidance, the princes learned not just how to wield weapons, but when and why they should be used. However, it was the arrival of Dronakarya that truly transformed the martial education of the princes. Drona had been born from a pot, the son of the sage Bharadvaja, and his mastery of weapons was legendary. His friendship with Drupada, a prince who had promised to share his kingdom when he became ruler, had ended in humiliation when Drupada, crowned as sovereign of Panchala, had spurned his childhood companion as beneath his notice. Driven by this insult and the need to provide for his family, the weapons master had come to Hastinapura, seeking the position of instructor. His demonstration of skill was so extraordinary that Bhishma immediately appointed the man as the guru of all the royal children. But the teacher harbored a secret purpose. He intended to use his royal students to gain revenge against his former friend, a goal that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire realm. Under this demanding tutelage, the martial abilities of the students flourished. The instructor was exacting but fair, pushing each pupil to excel in their chosen disciplines. Yudhishthira became proficient with the spear. Bhima mastered the mace with devastating effect, and the twins developed skills with sword and shield that made them formidable opponents. But it was the master archer who truly captured the instructor's attention and affection. The young warrior's dedication to his craft was absolute. He practiced in darkness to improve his night shooting. He learned to fire arrows by sound alone. And he demonstrated an ability to focus that impressed even his divine-born brothers. The weapons master began to teach his favored students secrets of warfare that he shared with no other pupil, including the use of celestial weapons that could devastate entire armies. This favoritism did not go unnoticed by the other students, particularly the Kaurava leader, who began to see in this preference yet another example of how the Pandavas were destined to eclipse the rest of the royal children in every arena. The seeds of jealousy, already planted by the circumstances of their births, began to grow into something darker and more dangerous. The tension between the cousins reached its first crisis during what should have been a celebration. The weapons master had organized a tournament to display the skills of his students, inviting the entire court and citizenry of Hastinapura to witness the prowess of the young warriors. The arena was magnificent, decorated with silk banners and filled with the flower of the nobility. Each student demonstrated their particular skills to the applause of the crowd. Yudhishthira's precision with the spear drew nods of approval from the assembled warriors. Bhima's exhibition with the mace was so powerful that the very ground shook beneath his blows. But when the master archer took the field for his display, the crowd fell silent in awe. The young warrior's performance transcended mere skill and entered the realm of the miraculous. He split arrows in mid-flight, struck targets that were hidden from view, and demonstrated techniques that bent the very laws of nature. The crowd erupted in cheers, and it appeared certain that the master archer had won not just the tournament, but the hearts of all who witnessed his display. But as the applause reached its peak, the sound of chariot wheels echoed from the arena's entrance. A figure emerged from the dust, tall and magnificent, his natural armor gleaming in the sunlight, and his earrings catching the light like captured fire. This was the foundling raised by the charioteer, though his true parentage remained unknown to all present. The armored warrior strode into the arena with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and declared his intention to match and surpass every feat that the master archer had just performed. The crowd murmured in shock. Who was this unknown challenger who dared to compete with the royal heir, whose skill they had just witnessed? But challenge he did, and to the amazement of all present, the newcomer matched his rival shot for shot, arrow for arrow. Every impossible feat that the favored student had demonstrated, the charioteer's son replicated with equal skill. The two warriors stood facing each other across the arena, their abilities so perfectly matched that it appeared as if one was the mirror image of the other. It was then that Kripacharya, acting as the tournament's judge, raised the question that would define much of what followed. "Young warrior," he called to the challenger, "your skill is evident to all, but this is a tournament for those of royal blood. What is your lineage? Who is your patron? By what right do you compete with the heirs of the throne?" The question struck the armored warrior like a physical blow. Here, in the moment of his greatest triumph, he was being reminded of his humble origins. The crowd's admiration turned to whispers of doubt, and the challenger found himself standing alone in the center of the arena, his achievement suddenly meaningless in the face of his birth. It was then that the Kaurava leader made a decision that would change the course of history. Rising from his seat among the royal family, he walked into the arena and placed his hand on the warrior's shoulder. "If it is royal blood that qualifies one to compete," he declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the arena, "then let this champion have it. I hereby declare him to be the ruler of Anga, a sovereign in his own right and my friend and ally." The gesture was magnificent in its generosity and devastating in its implications. The eldest Kaurava had not only solved the challenger's immediate problem, but had also gained for himself a warrior whose skills rivaled those of the master archer. More importantly, he had demonstrated a willingness to look beyond birth and tradition to recognize true merit, a quality that would earn loyalty from many who felt themselves overlooked by the established order. The newly crowned ruler, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness, knelt before his benefactor and swore an oath that would bind his life forever. "My lord," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given me more than a realm. You have given me dignity. My life is yours to command, and I shall never forget this debt." Thus began the friendship between the two warriors, a bond forged in mutual need and recognition that would prove stronger than the ties of blood or duty. The Kaurava heir had found not just a champion, but a loyal companion who shared his sense of being undervalued, despite obvious qualities. For the newly elevated ruler, this acceptance offered something he had never known, a place where his abilities mattered more than his origins. But this moment of triumph for the Kaurava heir was also the moment when the division between the cousins became irreparable. The master archer, who had basked in the crowd's adoration just moments before, now found himself facing a rival whose skill equaled his own. Bhima, ever protective of his brothers, saw in the challenger's elevation a threat to their family's position. Yudhishthira, though he understood the justice of the gesture, recognized that it had shifted the balance of power in ways that might prove dangerous. As the tournament concluded and the crowd dispersed, the royal children returned to the palace changed. The easy camaraderie of their childhood had been replaced by something more complex and potentially dangerous. Lines had been drawn, alliances had been formed, and the first moves in a game that would consume them all had been played. In the days that followed, the implications of the tournament began to manifest in countless small ways. Training sessions that had once been cooperative became competitive. Meals that had once been filled with laughter became exercises in careful diplomacy. The very air in the palace seemed charged with tension that had not existed before. Drona, observing these changes, decided that the time had come to test his students in a more practical manner. He called them together and revealed his true purpose in coming to Hastinapura, his desire for revenge against Drupada. As payment for their education, he demanded that they capture the ruler of Panchala and bring him back alive. The expedition to Panchala became the first real test of the royal children's abilities in actual combat, rather than training exercises. The Kaurava leader, eager to prove himself, led his forces in the initial assault on the enemy capital. But despite their numbers and enthusiasm, they were repelled by the experienced warriors of Panchala, much to their humiliation. It was then that the Pandavas entered the battle, their celestial heritage manifest in their prowess. The master archer's arrows found their targets with supernatural accuracy. Bhima's mace cleared paths through enemy formations, and Yudhishthira's tactical acumen coordinated their assault with devastating effectiveness. Within hours, they had achieved what their cousins had failed to accomplish, capturing the sovereign and presenting the prize to their teacher. The success of the Pandavas, where the Kauravas had failed, only deepened the rift between the cousins. The eldest Kaurava's humiliation was complete, and his resentment toward his divine-born cousins reached new heights. But worse was to come, for the instructor's revenge would set in motion events that would ultimately lead to the destruction of nearly everyone involved. When the captured sovereign was brought before his former friend, the instructor's words were measured but cutting. "Now, old companion," he said, "perhaps you remember the playmate you once knew. I return half your realm to you, as you should have done for me when fortune favored you. Now we are equals again. You rule half of Panchala, and I rule the other half." The humiliation was carefully calculated and devastating in its effect. The fallen ruler was forced to acknowledge his captor as an equal, but the hatred that burned in his eyes promised that this would not be the end of their conflict. Released to rule his diminished realm, the humiliated sovereign immediately began planning his revenge, seeking ways to obtain a son who could kill his tormentor and restore his family's honor. Through powerful sacrifices and celestial intervention, these prayers were answered. From the sacred fire emerged two children, Drishtadyumna, born to be the weapons master's destroyer, and Draupadi, a daughter whose beauty was matched only by her destiny, to become the catalyst for the greatest war the world had ever seen. But these developments lay in the future. For now, the princes returned to Hastinapura, their education complete, but their relationships forever altered. The tournament had revealed not just their abilities, but their characters, and the expedition to Panchala had demonstrated that power and skill alone were not enough to ensure victory or respect. In the palace, Dhritarashtra struggled with the implications of what had occurred. His love for his sons blinded him to their faults, but even he could see that the balance of power between the two branches of the family had shifted decisively in favor of the Pandavas. Their divine heritage, their superior skills, and their growing reputation throughout the kingdom made them the natural heirs to the throne, regardless of which prince was technically elder. This realization filled the blind sovereign with dread, for he could not bear the thought of his sons being relegated to subordinate positions. His queen, Gandhari, shared his concerns, but was wise enough to see the dangers that lay ahead if these tensions were not resolved. Yet her advice, though sound, fell on ears deafened by paternal love and pride. Meanwhile, the people of Hastinapura had begun to take sides, though many were unaware they were doing so. The Pandavas' heroic deeds and noble bearing won them admirers throughout the realm, while the Kaurava leaders' charisma and generosity earned a different but equally devoted following. The domain that had once been united under the regency of Dhritarashtra was slowly but inexorably dividing along lines that reflected the division within the royal family itself. As the seasons passed and the young warriors matured from adolescence into men, the question of succession began to loom larger in everyone's minds. Traditionally, the throne should pass to the eldest heir, but which warrior was truly eldest, Yudhishthira or his Kaurava cousin, was a matter of some debate. More importantly, the realm's needs and the people's preferences were beginning to favor the Pandavas, whose qualities appeared better suited to leadership in these changing times. The stage was set for the next phase of the drama, one that would test not just the heirs' abilities, but their character and their commitment to the bonds of family and duty. The childhood games were over, and the real contest for the soul of the dynasty was about to begin. The years following the tournament had brought subtle but profound changes to the atmosphere within Hastinapura's palace walls. What had once been a unified royal household now harbored two distinct camps, each gravitating around their respective leaders. The Pandavas continued to excel in every endeavor they undertook, their divine heritage manifesting in ways that seemed to confirm their destiny for greatness. Meanwhile, their cousins, led by the increasingly bitter eldest Kaurava, watched these successes with growing resentment. As the young men reached marriageable age, news arrived from the distant realm of Panchala that would alter the course of their lives forever. The humiliated sovereign, still nursing his wounds from the weapons master's revenge, had announced a Swayamvara for his miraculous daughter, the princess born from the sacred fire, who had emerged as one of the most beautiful women in all the known world. The Swayamvara, an ancient custom where a princess could choose her own husband from among assembled suitors, promised to be the grandest gathering of royalty and warriors that the age had seen. But this would be no ordinary bride-choosing ceremony. The challenge set by the father was so difficult that most believed it impossible. A massive bow that required tremendous strength merely to string, and a target so small and positioned so high that only an archer of supernatural skill could hope to strike it. Word of this challenge spread like wildfire throughout the land, reaching every palace and warrior's hall. For the young men of Hastinapura, it represented both opportunity and test. Success would bring not only a bride of incomparable beauty, but also alliance with Panchala, one of the most powerful realms. Failure would mean public humiliation before the assembled nobility of the world. The Pandavas, having completed their education under the weapons master, decided to attend the Swayamvara, not as representatives of their royal house, but in disguise. Recent events in the palace had made their position increasingly precarious, and they felt it wise to test the wider world's reception before revealing their intentions fully. Disguised as wandering Brahmins, holy men devoted to learning and spirituality, they made their way to Panchala, accompanied by their mother, Kunti. The journey itself proved to be as transformative as their destination. Traveling on foot through forests and villages, sleeping under the stars, and depending on the hospitality of common people, the brothers gained insights into the lives of their future subjects that palace walls could never have provided. They encountered sages whose wisdom transcended worldly concerns, witnessed the struggles of farmers whose lives depended on the whims of weather and fortune, and saw how ordinary people dealt with the fundamental questions of duty and righteousness that would later challenge them in far more complex forms. During one particularly significant encounter, they met an elderly sage named Vyasa, the very same mysterious figure who had sired their fathers and who served as the cosmic narrator of their entire story. Though they did not fully understand his true nature, his words carried weight that seemed to resonate in their souls. He spoke to them of the nature of Dharma, explaining how righteousness was not a simple set of rules to be followed, but a living principle that required constant interpretation and reinterpretation based on circumstances. The path of righteousness, the sage told them as they sat around a small fire in a forest clearing, is not always the path that appears most righteous to others. Sometimes duty demands actions that seem to contradict duty itself. The greatest warriors are not those who never face moral dilemmas, but those who navigate them with wisdom and courage, accepting the consequences of their choices without losing sight of their ultimate purpose. These words would prove prophetic in ways none of them could imagine at the time, but for now they were simply young men on an adventure, their spirits light despite the serious purpose of their journey. The capital of Panchala, when they finally reached it, overwhelmed them with its grandeur. The entire city had been transformed for the Swayamvara, with pavilions and viewing stands constructed to accommodate the thousands of visitors who had come to witness the spectacle. Warriors and kings from every corner of the known world had assembled, each believing himself capable of meeting the impossible challenge. The brothers found lodging in the humble quarters, designated for Brahmins and other religious visitors, maintaining their disguise, even as they observed the preparations with keen interest. The master archer, in particular, studied the great bow and the elevated target, with the analytical eye of one trained in the subtleties of his craft. What others saw as an impossible challenge, he began to understand as a puzzle to be solved through technique and understanding, rather than mere strength. The morning of the Swayamvara dawned clear and bright, with thousands gathering in the great arena that had been constructed for the occasion. The princess herself, whose beauty had been the subject of countless songs and stories, took her place on the elevated platform where she would observe the competition and ultimately make her choice. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed to contain both great wisdom and great passion, and her bearings suggested a spirit that would not be easily subdued or satisfied. One by one, the assembled warriors approached the great bow. Kings and princes, legendary fighters, and renowned archers all attempted to string the massive weapon and loose an arrow at the distant target. Some could not even lift the bow. Others managed to string it, but could not draw it. A few succeeded in drawing the string, but could not achieve the accuracy needed to strike the tiny target suspended high above the arena. As failure followed failure, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Perhaps the challenge truly was impossible. Perhaps the princess was destined to remain unmarried. Or perhaps this was some elaborate test whose true purpose had not yet been revealed. It was then that the master archer, still disguised as a simple Brahmin, rose from his place among the religious visitors and walked calmly toward the bow. A gasp went through the crowd. What was this unknown holy man doing approaching a warrior's challenge? Several kings protested that the competition was meant for Kshatriyas, the warrior class, not for wandering Brahmins. But the princess herself, studying the young man's bearing and the grace with which he moved, gestured for the challenge to proceed. Something in his demeanor suggested that this was no ordinary Brahmin, and her curiosity was piqued. The archer approached the great bow with reverence rather than bravado, touching it gently as if greeting an old friend. Then, in one fluid motion that made the impossible appear effortless, he strung the massive weapon, drew back the string, and released an arrow that struck the target with perfect precision. The crowd erupted in amazement and confusion. Who was this mysterious Brahmin who had succeeded where kings and legendary warriors had failed? The princess, her choice made clear by the success of the challenge, descended from her platform and approached the victorious archer. With grace and dignity, she placed the victory garland around his neck, accepting him as her chosen husband. But the drama was far from over. Several of the defeated kings, furious at being bested by what they believed to be a common Brahmin, drew their weapons and advanced on the victor and his prize. It was then that the other Pandava brothers revealed their own combat skills, defending their brother and the princess with a prowess that made it clear these were no ordinary religious students. Bhima's strength scattered attackers like leaves before a storm, while the twins fought with a coordination and skill that spoke of years of intensive training. Yudhishthira's commanding presence and tactical mind organized their defense with an efficiency that no mere Brahmin could have possessed. The battle was brief but decisive, and when it ended, the mysterious Brahmins departed with the princess, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with speculation about their true identity. But among the observers was one figure who had recognized them despite their disguises. Krishna, the dark-skinned prince of the Yadava clan, whose own divine nature allowed him to see through their deception. Krishna's recognition of the Pandavas marked the beginning of a relationship that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Though he said nothing at the time, his knowing smile suggested that he understood far more about the cosmic significance of these events than anyone else present. The journey back to their temporary home was filled with excitement and anticipation. The princess, whose name was Draupadi, proved to be not only beautiful, but intelligent and spirited, engaging her new husband and his brothers in conversations that revealed a mind as sharp as any blade. She seemed untroubled by their humble disguise, as if she sensed that there was far more to these men than their appearance suggested. But it was when they reached their lodging that the most shocking development of all occurred. As was customary, the master archer called out to his mother that they had returned from their day's activities and had brought back something wonderful. Kunti, without looking up from her tasks and speaking in the tone mothers use when addressing children who have probably found some interesting but ultimately trivial object, replied, "Whatever you have brought, share it equally among all 5 of you." The words, once spoken, could not be taken back. In their tradition, a mother's word was sacred and must be obeyed. But how could they possibly share a wife among 5 brothers? The very suggestion seemed to violate every principle of proper marriage and social order. Yet as they pondered this dilemma, they began to remember fragments of stories and legends that suggested such arrangements were not entirely unknown in ancient times. More importantly, Draupadi herself, when the situation was explained to her, displayed a wisdom that surprised them all. Rather than being horrified by the prospect, she seemed to consider it thoughtfully, as if recognizing some deeper purpose in these events. Vyasa, appearing at this crucial moment as he had a habit of doing whenever cosmic purposes needed clarification, explained that this unusual marriage had been ordained by fate itself. In a previous life, Draupadi had prayed to Lord Shiva for a husband, repeating her request 5 times in her devotion. The god had granted her prayer literally. She would indeed have a husband, but 5 of them, each representing different aspects of the ideal mate she had sought. Furthermore, the sage revealed this arrangement would serve a greater cosmic purpose. The 5 brothers, each born of different gods and possessing different divine qualities, would together represent the complete spectrum of righteous rulership. Their shared wife would serve as the binding force that kept them united, ensuring that their individual strengths complemented rather than competed with each other. And so, the most unusual marriage in royal history was solemnized, with Draupadi becoming the wife of all 5 Pandava brothers. To maintain harmony and prevent jealousy, they established careful rules governing their relationships. Each brother would spend 1 year as Draupadi's primary husband, during which time the others would treat her as a sister-in-law rather than a wife. Any brother who violated this arrangement would face exile. The marriage brought immediate political benefits as well as personal ones. The alliance with Panchala transformed the Pandavas from displaced princes living on the charity of their uncle into a significant political force in their own right. The humiliated sovereign, recognizing the true identity of his new sons-in-law, embraced them as the allies he had hoped to gain in his ongoing conflicts with various enemies. But perhaps most importantly, the marriage brought them into close contact with Krishna, whose friendship with Draupadi's brother Drishtadyumna made him a regular presence in their lives. The dark prince of the Yadavas proved to be unlike anyone they had ever encountered, possessed of wisdom that seemed to transcend ordinary understanding. yet capable of enjoying simple pleasures with infectious enthusiasm. Krishna's counsel became invaluable to the brothers as they navigated the complex political landscape of their time. He understood the deeper currents that moved beneath the surface of events, seeing patterns and connections that escaped others. More importantly, he seemed to grasp the cosmic significance of their roles in ways that they themselves were only beginning to comprehend. Under his guidance, they began to understand that they were not merely individuals seeking their fortunes, but instruments of a greater purpose. The divine blood that flowed in their veins carried with it responsibilities that extended far beyond personal success or family loyalty. They were being prepared for challenges that would test not just their abilities, but the very foundations of Dharma itself. The years of their youth had ended, and the years of their testing were about to begin. But they faced the future with confidence born of their successes, their strong bonds of brotherhood, and their growing understanding of their destiny. The forest years had taught them lessons that palace education could never have provided, and they were ready for whatever trials awaited them. Yet even as they celebrated their good fortune and looked forward to reclaiming their rightful place in the world, the seeds of the greater conflict were already being sown. In Hastinapura, their cousins watched these developments with growing alarm and resentment. The Pandavas had not only survived their exile, but had emerged stronger and more dangerous than ever. The question was no longer whether conflict would come, but when and in what form. The stage was set for the next act in the cosmic drama, one that would see the brothers tested in ways they could not yet imagine. But for now, they were content to savor their victory and plan for a future that seemed bright with promise. The forest had taught them much about themselves and their world. Soon, they would have the opportunity to apply those lessons in the far more complex arena of royal politics and family loyalty. The news of the marriage and alliance with Panchala struck Hastinapura like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. What had begun as the convenient exile of potential rivals had transformed into the emergence of a formidable political force that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The 5 brothers, who had left the capital as dependents living on royal charity, had returned as sons-in-law to one of the most powerful rulers in the land, backed by both celestial heritage and earthly alliance. Dhritarashtra found himself caught between competing emotions and loyalties. As their uncle and the current occupant of the throne, he felt genuine joy at his nephew's success and safe return. Yet as a father who loved his own sons with fierce devotion, he could not ignore the threat this development posed to their futures. The blind monarch's internal struggle reflected the larger tensions that were beginning to tear the realm apart. His queen, Gandhari, possessed the clearer vision that her husband's physical blindness often paralleled in the moral sphere. She recognized that the return of the 5 brothers with such enhanced status made conflict almost inevitable unless handled with extraordinary wisdom and restraint. Her counsel, as always, was sound but difficult to implement, given the passions and pride that had been building for so long. The eldest Kaurava's reaction was everything his parents feared it would be. The marriage to the princess represented not just a political setback, but a personal humiliation. He had watched his cousins excel throughout their youth, seen them gain fame and admiration that came effortlessly, and now they had secured an alliance that transformed them from potential threats into existential dangers to his own ambitions. More troubling still was the involvement of Krishna, whose reputation for wisdom and whose heavenly connections were well known throughout the region. The Dark Prince's support of his rivals added a dimension to their cause that transcended ordinary political calculation. This was no longer simply a dynastic dispute over inheritance, but a celestial alignment that favored their enemies at every turn. It was Krishna himself who proposed the solution that would temporarily resolve the immediate crisis. Arriving in the capital as both diplomat and heavenly messenger, he suggested a division of the realm that would give both branches of the royal house their due while avoiding direct confrontation. The 5 brothers would receive the barren lands of Kandavaprastha, a region that had been devastated by warfare and neglect, while their cousins would retain control of the prosperous heartland around the established seat of power. The proposal appeared generous to those who did not understand the deeper currents at work. The rival claimants would keep the established centers of power and wealth, while their cousins would receive lands that seemed barely worth governing. But Krishna's suggestion contained wisdom that extended beyond immediate political calculation. He recognized that the exiled princes possessed exactly the qualities needed to transform wasteland into paradise, while their celestial heritage would ensure that their efforts met with supernatural success. The division was agreed upon with reluctance on all sides, though for different reasons. Dhritarashtra hoped it would end the tensions that threatened to tear his lineage apart. The rival claimants saw it as a way to rid themselves of dangerous competitors while appearing magnanimous. The exiled princes accepted it as an opportunity to prove their worth and build something entirely their own. What followed was one of the most remarkable transformations in the annals of statecraft. The 5 siblings approached their new domain with the same celestial energy they brought to every endeavor. But this was no ordinary reclamation project. It was the creation of a new model of governance that would serve as a beacon for the rest of the world. The first challenge was simply making the land habitable. Decades of warfare had left the region depopulated and the irrigation systems in ruins. But the exiled rulers possessed advantages that ordinary monarchs lacked. Bhima's strength enabled construction projects that would have required hundreds of workers. The master archer's precision and focus ensured that every effort was directed efficiently toward maximum benefit. The eldest prince's wisdom in governance attracted settlers and administrators who believed in the vision he articulated. More importantly, they had the guidance of Krishna, whose understanding of both practical statecraft and universal principles ensured that their city would be built on foundations stronger than mere stone and mortar. Under his direction, they planned not just a capital, but a statement about what human society could become when guided by righteousness rather than mere ambition. The city they created became known as Indraprastha, the city of Indra, and its magnificence exceeded anything previously seen in the mortal world. But its true glory lay not in its physical splendor, but in the principles upon which it was founded. Justice was administered with perfect fairness, regardless of social status. Trade flourished under regulations that protected both merchants and customers. The arts and learning were patronized with a generosity that attracted scholars and artists from across the known world. At the heart of this new city stood a palace complex that defied easy description. Working with Maya, a master architect whose skills bordered on the magical, they created a structure that challenged the very boundaries between reality and illusion. Rooms appeared larger than their physical dimensions should have allowed. Walls seemed solid until touched, then revealed themselves to be constructed of air and light. Pools of water appeared so real that visitors would lift their robes to avoid getting wet, only to discover they were walking on crystalline floors that merely resembled liquid. This palace of illusions served both practical and symbolic purposes. On the practical level, it demonstrated the exiled prince's access to knowledge and power that transcended ordinary understanding. Symbolically, it represented the very nature of existence itself, a realm where appearance and reality constantly interacted in ways that challenged conventional understanding. Word of these wonders spread throughout the land, reaching every court and every warrior's hall. Stories told of a city where justice reigned supreme, where the hungry were fed and the dispossessed found refuge, where learning flourished and the arts reached new heights of expression. More disturbing to their rivals were reports of military strength that grew daily as warriors from distant lands came to serve rulers whose reputation for honor and generosity had become legendary. The culmination of their success came with the eldest prince's decision to perform the Rajasuya sacrifice, an ancient ritual that would formally establish him as an emperor rather than merely a regional ruler. This ceremony required the acknowledgement and participation of other monarchs, effectively forcing them to recognize his supremacy or declare themselves his enemies. The preparations for this ritual were themselves statements of power and righteousness. Delegations were sent to every corner of the known world, carrying not threats but invitations to participate in a celebration of Dharma's triumph. The responses revealed the extent to which their reputation had spread, and the degree to which their model of governance had impressed even potential rivals. One by one, the great rulers of the age arrived in Indraprastha, bringing tribute and acknowledgement of the eldest prince's claim to imperial status. The ceremony itself lasted for months, during which the finest scholars, priests, and performers in the world gathered to witness and participate in the ritual establishment of a new order. But it was during these celebrations that the seeds of the final conflict were most clearly sown. Among the visiting dignitaries were Dhritarashtra and his sons, who came ostensibly to honor their relatives, but whose true emotions were far more complex and dangerous. The eldest rival's first sight of Indraprastha's magnificence struck him like a physical blow. The city he beheld surpassed not only his own capital, but every other urban center he had ever seen or imagined. Its prosperity was evident in every building, its justice manifest in every interaction he witnessed, its cultural achievements visible in the art and architecture that surrounded him. But it was the palace of illusions that truly undid his composure. Walking through rooms where his senses were constantly deceived, where his understanding of reality was repeatedly challenged, he found himself becoming the victim of his own perceptions. At one point, mistaking a crystal floor for a pool of water, he lifted his robes unnecessarily, only to realize his error when laughter erupted from nearby observers. Later, attempting to walk through what appeared to be an opening, he struck his head against a wall of transparent crystal. Each mistake was minor in itself, but collectively they created a pattern of humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound. Here, in the palace built by his cousins, he was revealed as confused and diminished, a figure of amusement rather than respect. The laughter that followed his mishaps, particularly when it came from the princess and her companions, burned in his memory like acid. The final humiliation came when he attempted to walk through what appeared to be solid ground, only to plunge waist-deep into a pool that his eyes had not recognized as water. Emerging dripping and mortified while laughter echoed around him, he experienced a moment of rage and shame that would color every subsequent decision he made. The princess's comment, whether real or imagined, that the blind begetting the blind, would echo in his thoughts for decades to come. In that moment, standing in his cousin's palace, surrounded by evidence of their success and his own inadequacy, the last restraints on his jealousy and resentment finally gave way. The return journey to the capital was conducted in ominous silence. The contrast between Indraprastha's magnificence and his own seat of power's more modest achievements gnawed at the heir's pride with every mile they traveled. His father's attempts to rationalize or minimize what they had witnessed only increased his frustration. while his mother's cautioned wisdom fell on ears deafened by wounded pride. It was then that his uncle, Shakuni, the master manipulator who had been waiting for precisely such an opportunity, began to whisper the suggestions that would lead to catastrophe. The clever advisor from Gandhara had harbored his own grievances against the Kuru lineage for decades, stemming from his sister's forced marriage to the blind ruler. Now he saw in his nephew's humiliation the perfect opportunity to achieve his own revenge while appearing to serve his household's interests. The plan that emerged from their conspiracies was diabolic in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. They would invite their rivals to the capital for what appeared to be a friendly game of chance, a popular pastime among warriors and nobles. But this would be no ordinary gaming session. Shakuni possessed skills in this arena that bordered on the supernatural, along with gaming pieces that obeyed his will rather than the laws of chance. The invitation, when it came, appeared innocent enough. The eldest prince received it as a gesture of reconciliation, an opportunity to heal the wounds that had been festering for so many seasons. His siblings were less enthusiastic, sensing dangers that their elder brother's trusting nature could not perceive. But the righteous king's own weakness, a compulsive inability to refuse any gaming challenge, made acceptance inevitable. Krishna, when consulted, offered warnings that were both cryptic and ominous. He spoke of universal cycles reaching their culmination, of heavenly purposes that required terrible sacrifices, of the need for righteousness to be tested in fires that would either purify or destroy everything they touched. But he also made it clear that the choices ahead were theirs to make, and that even celestial intervention could not spare them from the consequences of their decisions. And so the stage was set for the most fateful game in human history. The five brothers would travel to the capital, believing themselves to be participating in a reunion. Their cousins would welcome them with smiles that concealed daggers. Between them sat the loaded gaming pieces that would determine not just the fate of two royal houses, but the very future of righteousness itself. The greatest irony was that both sides entered this contest believing themselves to be in the right. The exiled princes saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate magnanimity toward their less fortunate cousins. Their rivals viewed it as their chance to reclaim what they believed had been wrongfully taken from them. Neither side fully understood that they were about to participate in a universal drama whose true purpose transcended their individual desires and grievances. When the five brothers arrived in the capital, they were received with all the honors due to visiting royalty. The palace had been prepared magnificently for their stay, and the gaming hall had been arranged with careful attention to every detail. The gaming board was crafted from the finest materials, and the assembled courtiers represented the cream of the nobility. Yet beneath this veneer of hospitality lay currents of tension that only the most perceptive could detect. The eldest prince entered the gaming hall with the confidence of one who had never lost a significant wager, unaware that his very weakness was being turned against him. His love of chance was well known, but what few understood was that it represented more than mere recreation. It was a compulsion that he could not resist, a flaw in his otherwise noble character that would prove to be the undoing of everything he had built. Shakuni took his place across from the eldest prince with the appearance of a kindly uncle, indulging his nephew's pastime. His gaming pieces, however, were no ordinary implements. Through dark arts and careful craftsmanship, they had been made to respond to his will rather than to chance. What appeared to be a fair contest was in reality an elaborate trap designed to strip the five brothers of everything they possessed. The game began innocently enough, with small wagers that the righteous king won as often as he lost. But gradually, Shakuni began to increase the stakes, each throw becoming more significant than the last. With each loss, the eldest prince's determination to recover his fortune grew stronger, leading him deeper into the web that had been carefully constructed around him. First went his personal wealth, the gold and jewels that any royal house accumulated over generations. These losses, though painful, appeared recoverable through future endeavors. Then came his chariots and horses, his weapons and armor, the physical symbols of his warrior status. Still, these were material possessions that could theoretically be replaced. But when his gambling fever truly took hold, the righteous ruler began wagering things that no rational man would risk. His palace in Indraprastha, the city he had built from wasteland into a wonder of the world, became a stake in the game. When that was lost, he wagered his entire realm, the fruits of decades of careful governance and the foundation of his people's prosperity. His siblings watched in growing horror as their eldest brother's addiction drove him to increasingly desperate wagers. They had tried to counsel restraint, to suggest that the game was somehow unfair. But their leader's pride and his unshakable belief in his own judgment made him deaf to their warnings. Each loss only convinced him that the next throw would restore his fortunes. When even his territories were gone, lost to Shakuni's supernatural gaming pieces, the eldest prince committed the ultimate folly. He wagered his siblings, these celestial-born warriors who had stood by him through every trial, who had helped him build his empire and shared in all his triumphs. One by one, he lost them all. First the twins, then Bhima, with his titanic strength, and finally the master archer whose skill had won them their princess herself. The hall fell silent as the implications of these losses became clear. The 5 brothers, who had entered as free men and honored guests, were now technically slaves, their fate subject to the whims of their cousins who had orchestrated their downfall. But the eldest prince's gambling fever had not yet reached its nadir. When Shakuni suggested that he might win everything back with a single throw, the righteous king made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wagered himself, staking his own freedom and status on one final cast of the gaming pieces. The throw was made, and like all the others, it was lost. The eldest brother sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation became clear. He was no longer a ruler or even a free man, but a slave who had gambled away not only his own future, but that of his beloved siblings. It was then that Shakuni delivered the final, devastating blow. "My dear nephew," he said with false sympathy, "you have lost much, but perhaps there is still hope. You have one possession left that might restore your fortunes, your beautiful wife. Will you wager the princess?" The suggestion was so outrageous, so contrary to every principle of honor and decency, that many in the assembly gasped in shock. No civilized man would risk his wife in a game of chance, particularly not a woman of such stature and virtue. But the eldest prince, trapped in the grip of his compulsion and desperate to recover all that he had lost, agreed to this final, unthinkable wager. The gaming pieces were thrown one last time, and predictably they fell in Shakuni's favor. The princess, born from fire, the wife of 5 celestial heroes, was now technically the property of their rivals. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in the entire saga. The eldest rival, drunk with victory and seasons of suppressed resentment, ordered that the princess be brought to the assembly hall to acknowledge her new status as his servant. When she resisted, arguing through messengers that her husband had no right to wager her since he had already lost himself, and therefore possessed nothing to stake, her protests were ignored. Dushasana, the second of the rival brothers, was sent to drag her bodily from her chambers to the assembly hall. He seized her by her hair, the magnificent dark locks that were her crown of beauty, and pulled her before the assembled court, while she was clad only in a single garment, having been caught during her monthly retreat, when women traditionally remained in seclusion. The sight of the proud princess being manhandled in this fashion horrified many of the assembled nobles, but none dared speak out against the ruling house in their own hall. Her eyes blazed with fury and humiliation, as she was forced to stand before the very men who had once paid her tribute and honor. But her humiliation was not yet complete. The victorious heir, seeking to demonstrate his power over his defeated rivals, commanded Dushasana to strip away her remaining garment, to display her naked before the assembly as the ultimate symbol of his enemy's defeat and disgrace. As Dushasana began to pull at her sari, the princess closed her eyes and called upon Krishna with all the devotion in her heart. "O Dark One," she prayed, "protector of the innocent, guardian of righteousness, save me in this hour of desperate need." What happened next transcended the realm of ordinary human experience. As Dushasana pulled away each length of cloth, new fabric appeared to replace it, as if the sari were infinite. He pulled and pulled until he was exhausted, but still the garment continued, protecting her modesty through celestial intervention. The assembly watched in awe and fear as this miracle unfolded before their eyes, a clear sign that the gods themselves were taking notice of these proceedings. Finally, Dushasana collapsed from exhaustion, unable to continue his shameful task, while the princess remained covered and protected by Krishna's grace. But she was far from finished. Standing before the assembly with all the dignity of her celestial birth, she spoke words that would echo through the ages. "You call yourselves noble warriors," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "yet you sit in silence while a woman is abused in your presence. You claim to follow righteousness, yet you permit injustice to flourish under your very noses. Know this, I will not forget what has happened here today. My hair, which has been defiled by the touch of that wretch, will not be bound again until it is washed in the blood of the one who dared to lay hands upon me." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and many who heard them felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This was no mere expression of anger, but a curse that would shape the destiny of everyone present. Even as the immediate crisis passed, the damage to the moral fabric of the court was irreparable. Lines had been crossed that should never have been violated, and the consequences would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. It was then that some of the elder statesmen, horrified by what they had witnessed, began to counsel moderation. Vidura, ever the voice of wisdom, warned that these actions would bring destruction upon the entire lineage. Bhishma, though constrained by his oath of loyalty to the throne, expressed his dismay at the proceedings. Even Dhritarashtra, blind though he was, could sense the universal disturbance that these events had created. Under pressure from these voices of reason, and perhaps sensing that they had pushed matters too far, the victorious claimants agreed to a modified punishment. Rather than remaining as permanent slaves, the defeated princes would be sentenced to 13 periods of exile, 12 to be spent in the forests, living as hermits and ascetics, followed by 1 period of hiding in disguise. If they were discovered during this final stretch, the entire sentence would begin again. The sentence was harsh, but not impossible, and it offered a glimmer of hope for eventual restoration. The 5 brothers accepted it, with the dignity that had always characterized their responses to adversity, but their acceptance came with its own implicit promise. They would return, and when they did, the accounts of this day would be settled in full. As they prepared to depart for their exile, Emotional farewells were exchanged with those who had remained loyal to them. Their mother Kunti chose to accompany them into the wilderness, as did the princess, whose commitment to her husbands transcended the artificial degradation they had all suffered. But perhaps the most significant development during these final preparations was a private conversation between Kunti and the warrior she had unknowingly wronged decades earlier. Summoning Karna to a secluded spot, she revealed the secret she had carried for so long, that he was her firstborn son, born of the sun god Surya, and therefore the eldest of her children. The revelation struck Karna like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about his identity and his place in the world was suddenly called into question. He was not the charioteer's son, but a prince by birth. Not an outsider seeking acceptance, but a rightful heir to the very throne his closest friend sought to claim. Kunti's purpose in revealing this truth was clear. She hoped to turn him away from his allies and toward his true kin, potentially averting the catastrophic war that increasingly appeared inevitable. "Join your siblings," she pleaded. "Take your rightful place as the eldest heir. Help heal the wounds that threaten to destroy our entire lineage." But Karna's response revealed the depth of his character and the complexity of his loyalties. Though shaken by the revelation, he refused to abandon the man who had given him dignity when the world had offered only scorn. "Mother," he said, using the title for the first time, "you gave me birth, but my friend gave me honor. You offer me a crown, but I have already sworn my life to another cause. I cannot betray the trust of the one man who saw worth in me when all others saw only a charioteer's son." He did, however, make one promise that would limit the scope of the coming tragedy. He swore to Kunti that he would not kill any of his siblings except for the master archer, his greatest rival, with whom his destiny had been intertwined since their first meeting at the tournament. "4 of your sons will survive our conflict," he assured her, "though I cannot guarantee which 4 they will be." This promise represented both mercy and tragedy. Mercy in that it limited the scope of destruction. Tragedy in that it confirmed the inevitability of the conflict to come. The universal drama was approaching its climax, and even celestial intervention could not prevent the testing of righteousness that lay ahead. Meanwhile, as the exiled princes prepared for their departure, and their rivals consolidated their victory, forces were already in motion that would ultimately determine the outcome of their conflict. Krishna, watching these events unfold with the perspective of universal wisdom, began to prepare for his own role in the drama that was to come. The Dark Prince understood what others could not, that this conflict was necessary for the preservation of righteousness itself. The old order, corrupted by blindness and selfishness, had to be swept away, so that a new age of justice could emerge. The price would be terrible, but the alternative, allowing injustice to triumph permanently, was even worse. As the 5 brothers finally departed the capital for their exile, they carried with them not just the burden of their immediate suffering, but the weight of universal purpose. Their time in the wilderness would test them in ways that palace life never could, preparing them for challenges that would require every ounce of strength, wisdom, and righteousness they possessed. The gaming pieces had been cast, the sentences pronounced, and the players moved into position. All that remained was for time to run its course and for destiny to unfold according to the celestial plan that encompassed them all. The road to war had been chosen, and there would be no turning back. 13 seasons had passed since the fateful gaming session that changed the course of history. The exiled princes had endured their punishment with dignity, spending 12 periods in the wilderness learning lessons that no palace education could provide, followed by a final stretch hidden in disguise at the court of King Virata. Now they stood once again as free men, their sentence completed, ready to reclaim what had been taken from them through treachery and loaded gaming pieces. The wilderness had transformed them in ways both visible and profound. Their bodies had been hardened by years of ascetic discipline, their minds sharpened by constant vigilance and meditation, their spirits tempered by suffering and loss. But perhaps most importantly, they had gained allies whose loyalty was forged in the crucible of shared hardship rather than mere political convenience. When the time came to demand the return of their rightful inheritance, the response from their cousins was as predictable as it was devastating. The usurpers, having grown accustomed to ruling the entire realm, refused to return even a village, claiming that the original agreement had been fulfilled by the completion of the exile. The righteous king's reasonable requests for justice met with mocking dismissal, and his appeals to family bonds fell on ears deafened by greed and pride. It was then that the Dark Prince stepped forward to serve as mediator between the warring branches of the royal house. His reputation for wisdom and his connections to both sides made him the natural choice for this crucial mission. But his journey to the capital was undertaken with little hope of success. He understood better than anyone that the cosmic forces now in motion had passed beyond the point where mere diplomacy could alter their course. Standing before the assembled court with all the dignity of his celestial nature, the divine mediator made an offer that would have satisfied any reasonable petitioner. He proposed that the 5 brothers be granted just 5 villages, one for each sibling, allowing them to live with honor while leaving the vast majority of the realm in their cousins' hands. The proposal was so modest, so clearly just, that rejection would brand the refusing party as utterly unreasonable in the eyes of the world. Yet reject it they did, with an arrogance that shocked even those who had grown accustomed to their excesses. The eldest usurper declared that he would not grant his rivals so much as a needle's point of land, revealing the depth of his hatred and the blindness of his ambition. The assembly sat in stunned silence as they witnessed the final collapse of any hope for peaceful resolution. But the Dark Prince had not come merely to negotiate. He had come to bear witness to the choice that would determine the fate of the world. Rising to his full height, his form seeming to fill the vast hall, he revealed why simple diplomacy had failed. In words that resonated with the power of universal truth, he explained that this was no ordinary succession dispute, but a struggle between Dharma and Adharma itself. Then, in a moment that transcended the boundaries of mortal experience, the divine messenger revealed his true nature to the assembled court. His familiar human form began to expand and transform, revealing the cosmic consciousness that lay beneath. Those present beheld the Vishvarupa, the universal form that contained within itself all of creation and destruction, all past and future, all possibilities and certainties. The vision was overwhelming in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Courtiers cowered as they saw themselves and their fates written in the cosmic dance of creation and dissolution. Some saw their own deaths in the coming war. Others glimpsed the futility of their earthly ambitions when measured against the infinite. The usurper himself, confronted with this display of ultimate reality, felt his defiance waver for the first time. But the moment passed, and with it the last opportunity for wisdom to prevail over pride. The divine prince resumed his human form, but his message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. The heavens themselves had chosen sides in this struggle, and those who opposed Dharma would face consequences that extended far beyond their earthly existence. With diplomacy exhausted and war inevitable, both sides began the grim preparations for combat. But this would be no ordinary dispute between rival claimants to a throne. The alliances that formed transcended regional boundaries and ancient enmities, drawing in fighters and rulers from across the known world. Old friendships were tested, family bonds were strained, and loyalties were divided in ways that would have seemed impossible in more peaceful times. The commanders on both sides understood that this war would be decided not merely by the courage of individual fighters, but by the wisdom of alliances and the loyalty of friends. The Divine Prince, though he had pledged not to take up weapons himself, offered his support to whichever side desired it more greatly. When given the choice between his council as advisor or his mighty army as fighters, the exiled prince chose wisdom over strength, while his rivals eagerly claimed the military force for themselves. The gathering of armies transformed the landscape itself. From every direction, soldiers converged on the chosen battlefield, the sacred plain of Kurukshetra, where Dharma would be tested in the crucible of combat. Elephants trumpeted, horses whinnied, and the metallic ring of weapons being sharpened filled the air. The very earth groaned under the weight of so many fighters gathered in one place. Among the legendary fighters who took the field were names that would echo through history. The grandsire Bhishma, bound by his ancient oath to serve the throne, reluctantly took command of the usurper's forces despite his sympathy for the righteous cause. The weapons instructor Drona, seeking to fulfill obligations to his royal students, aligned himself with those who had given him position and status. Karna, the sun-born champion whose true parentage remained hidden, stood ready to prove his loyalty to the friend who had elevated him from obscurity. On the other side gathered those who fought for justice rather than mere political advantage. The five brothers themselves, each a specialist in his chosen discipline, led forces that included not only their Panchala allies, but soldiers from distant lands who had been drawn by their reputation for honor. The sight of these two great armies, facing each other across the plain, was enough to make even veteran fighters pause in recognition of the magnitude of what was about to unfold. But perhaps no fighter faced a greater internal struggle than the archer himself. As dawn broke on the first day of combat, revealing the full scope of the assembled forces, he found himself confronting a moral crisis that threatened to paralyze him completely. Looking across the field, he saw not enemies, but teachers who had shaped his youth, cousins who had shared his childhood, and elders whom duty commanded him to revere. The weight of what was about to happen struck him with devastating force. This was not some abstract struggle between good and evil, but a family war that would destroy the very foundations of the world he had known. Victory would mean the death of beloved teachers, the slaughter of childhood companions, and the end of an entire way of life. Even the throne itself appeared a poor prize when measured against such losses. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of these realizations, the archer sank to the floor of his chariot, his magnificent bow slipping from nerveless fingers. "I cannot fight," he declared to his charioteer, who happened to be the Divine Prince himself. What victory could be worth the price we must pay for it? What throne could justify the destruction of those we love? It was then that his charioteer spoke the words that would become the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Divine, perhaps the most profound spiritual discourse ever recorded. In the moments before the greatest war in history, with armies waiting and trumpets about to sound, the Dark Prince revealed truths about duty, destiny, and the very nature of existence itself. Your grief is for those who should not be grieved for, the divine teacher began, his voice carrying both infinite compassion and absolute authority. The wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead. Just as the soul puts on new garments, giving up the old ones, so does it accept new bodies, giving up the old and useless ones. The discourse that followed touched on every aspect of human existence and heavenly truth. The instructor explained that action performed in accordance with duty, without attachment to results, was the highest form of spiritual practice. He revealed that the soul itself was eternal and indestructible, merely moving from one body to another as a person changes clothes. Most importantly, he demonstrated that sometimes the path of Dharma required actions that appeared terrible on the surface, but served a greater cosmic purpose. As the divine teacher spoke, his students' despair began to transform into understanding. The archer came to see that his individual will was part of a larger pattern, and that his duty as a fighter was not separate from his spiritual obligations, but an expression of them. The war ahead was not merely a political struggle, but a necessary cleansing that would remove corrupt elements from the world and restore the balance between Dharma and evil. When the celestial instructor revealed his cosmic form once again, showing his student the universal consciousness that pervaded all existence, the last of the archer's doubts vanished. He understood that he was not the true agent of these actions, but an instrument through which divine will would manifest. His duty was to act in accordance with Dharma, while surrendering the fruits of action to the divine. Rising from his chariot floor with renewed purpose, the archer took up his bow once more. The man who had entered the battlefield in despair now stood ready to fight with the clarity that comes from perfect understanding of one's role in the cosmic order. The time for words had ended, and the time for action had arrived. The 18-day war that followed would test every principle of warfare and honor that had guided civilized combat for generations. What began as a noble contest between worthy opponents would gradually descend into increasingly desperate tactics as the enormous stakes became clear to all participants. On the first day, the armies arrayed themselves according to ancient protocols, with formal challenges issued and accepted according to the established rules of engagement. Fighters engaged only their equals. Hostilities ended at sunset, and the wounded were treated with respect regardless of their allegiance. The grandsire Bhishma, despite his age, proved that his martial skills remained undiminished, cutting through enemy formations like fire through dry grass. But as the war continued, the enormous pressure of competing loyalties and the sheer scale of destruction began to wear away at traditional restraints. Fighters who had begun the struggle with noble intentions found themselves driven to increasingly extreme measures by desperation and grief. The death of beloved companions, the sight of their own forces being decimated, and the growing realization that only complete victory or total defeat awaited them all, combined to erode the civilized conventions that had previously governed warfare. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Challenges that had once been issued formally between individual combatants evolved into coordinated attacks by multiple fighters against single opponents. Combat that had previously ended at sunset began to continue into the night. Weapons that had been forbidden in honorable engagement started to appear on the field as desperation overcame scruple. By the 10th day, when the grandsire Bhishma finally fell, brought down not by superior skill, but by the strategic placement of a fighter whom honor prevented him from attacking, it was clear that the old rules were crumbling. The death of this most revered figure, accomplished through what amounted to deception, even though it remained technically within the bounds of warfare, marked the beginning of a new and darker phase of the struggle. The weapons instructor, Drona, taking command after Bhishma's fall, proved even more devastating in his application of military science. His knowledge of celestial weapons and his mastery of tactical formations created havoc among his former students' forces. It became clear that conventional means would not suffice to defeat him, leading to a desperate stratagem that would further compromise the moral clarity with which the war had begun. The plan to defeat the instructor involved deceiving him into believing that his beloved son had been killed in combat. The righteous king, who had never spoken a falsehood in his life, was prevailed upon to make a statement that was technically true but fundamentally misleading. When the teacher, overwhelmed by grief at what he believed to be his son's death, laid down his weapons in despair, he was struck down by an enemy fighter while defenseless. This violation of the code, killing an opponent who had surrendered his weapons, sent shockwaves through both armies. Soldiers who had maintained their faith in the justice of their cause began to question whether victory achieved through such means could ever be truly honorable. Yet the momentum carried them forward, each side now convinced that their opponent's willingness to abandon honor justified their own descent into increasingly questionable tactics. The 13th day brought perhaps the most tragic single event of the entire war. Young Abhimanyu, the son of the archer, found himself isolated and surrounded by 7 of the greatest fighters on the opposing side. The youth, barely 16 seasons old, fought with a courage that impressed even his enemies, but he was ultimately overwhelmed and killed in a manner that violated every principle of fair combat. The news of his son's death, achieved through what amounted to the murder of a child by adult soldiers who should have known better, pushed the archer to the very limits of his endurance. His grief transformed into a terrible resolve for vengeance that would color every subsequent day of fighting. The man who had entered the struggle reluctantly now fought with a fury that terrified even his allies. It was on this day that Gatotkacha, the son of Bhima and the forest-dwelling Hidimba, made his final contribution to the cause of Dharma. This powerful champion, who possessed abilities inherited from his supernatural mother, had long been held in reserve for the most crucial moment. When that moment came, he unleashed his full power against the enemy forces, wreaking such havoc that only the ultimate weapon could stop him. Karna, finally forced to use the divine spear that he had been saving for his final confrontation with his greatest rival, reluctantly employed it against Gatotkacha. The death of this mighty fighter was a significant loss for the righteous forces, but it also meant that Karna had expended his most powerful weapon and would face the archer with conventional arms alone. As the war entered its final phase, the pretense of honorable warfare had been almost entirely abandoned. Soldiers fought with whatever means came to hand. Alliances shifted based on momentary advantage, and the very concept of justice became blurred by the smoke and blood of endless combat. What had begun as a noble attempt to restore rightful rule had become a desperate struggle for survival, in which the traditional distinctions between right and wrong increasingly lost meaning. Yet even in this darkest hour, moments of transcendent heroism continued to shine through the chaos. Individual fighters on both sides displayed courage and honor that illuminated the human spirit, even as the larger struggle descended into nightmare. These acts of nobility, performed without hope of recognition or reward, served as reminders that the divine spark within humanity could not be entirely extinguished even by the most terrible circumstances. The cosmic drama was approaching its climax, but the price of victory, for whichever side ultimately prevailed, was mounting beyond anything that could have been imagined when the first arrows were loosed. The field of Kurukshetra had become a testing ground where the very nature of Dharma itself was being refined in fires that would either purify or destroy everything they touched. The final days of the Great War brought a resolution that tasted more of ashes than triumph. As the sun set on the 18th day of combat, the field of Kurukshetra lay silent except for the moaning of the wounded and the cries of carrion birds already gathering to feast on the fallen. What had begun as a noble quest to restore rightful rule had ended in a devastation so complete that victory itself seemed hollow. The decisive moment had come in the climactic duel between Karna and his greatest rival. These two champions, whose skills had been perfectly matched since their first meeting at the tournament so many seasons ago, finally faced each other in single combat with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. The sun-born warrior fought with desperate courage, knowing that his divine parentage remained hidden from all but a few, while the archer wielded his bow with the terrible precision that grief and righteous anger had honed to supernatural sharpness. The duel might have continued indefinitely, so evenly matched were the combatants, but fate intervened in the form of an ancient curse. Karna's chariot wheel became mired in the earth at the crucial moment, leaving him vulnerable as he dismounted to free it. In that instant of helplessness, when honor demanded that combat cease until both fighters were equally positioned, the archer hesitated, but the divine prince, serving as his charioteer, reminded him that this was war, not a tournament, and that their enemies had long since abandoned such niceties. The arrow that ended Karna's life also marked the beginning of the end for the losing side. With their greatest champion fallen, the remaining defenders began to lose heart. One by one, the legendary figures who had dominated the battlefield throughout the long struggle met their doom. Shalya, the skilled spearman who had taken command after Karna's death, fell to the righteous king's weapon. Shakuni, the mastermind whose loaded dice had triggered this entire catastrophe, was finally hunted down and killed by the powerful Bhima, who had nursed his hatred for the manipulator through 13 periods of exile and 18 days of slaughter. The final confrontation came between the two cousins, whose rivalry had poisoned their entire generation. The eldest of the 100 brothers, seeing his forces scattered and his cause lost, challenged Bhima to single combat with maces, weapons that both had mastered in their youth under the same teacher. The duel that followed was more than a fight between two men. It was the culmination of a lifetime of jealousy, resentment, and wounded pride. They fought among the corpses of their fallen comrades, their heavy weapons ringing against each other with sounds like thunder. Both possessed enormous strength and had been trained by the same instructors in the same techniques, making their combat a mirror of perfection and destruction. For hours they battled, neither able to gain decisive advantage over the other, their endurance seeming superhuman as they pounded each other with blows that would have felled ordinary men. But Bhima carried with him not just physical strength, but the accumulated rage of decades of humiliation. He remembered every slight, every injustice, every moment of shame that his family had endured because of his opponent's blind ambition. Most particularly, he remembered the Princess Draupadi being dragged into the assembly hall by her hair, and his own impotence as he watched her suffer degradation that no woman should endure. The end came when Bhima struck below the belt, a blow that was technically against the rules of honorable combat, but which he justified by recalling all the times their enemies had abandoned honor for advantage. His opponent fell with a mortal wound, crying out in agony and accusing his cousin of fighting unfairly. But Bhima felt no remorse as he reminded the dying man of the princess's humiliation and the vow she had made that day. True to her word, Draupadi came to the battlefield where her tormentor lay dying. Kneeling beside him, she unbound her magnificent hair, those dark locks that had been defiled by unwelcome touch so many seasons ago. As life ebbed from his eyes, she washed her hair in his blood, finally fulfilling the terrible vow that had haunted them all since that shameful day in the assembly hall. With the death of their leader, the last organized resistance collapsed. The few survivors of the losing side fled the field or threw themselves on the mercy of the victors. What had once been two mighty armies had been reduced to scattered bands of traumatized men stumbling through a landscape littered with the bodies of friends and enemies alike. But victory brought no joy to the triumphant side. As they walked through the charnel house that Kurukshetra had become, counting their own losses and surveying the magnitude of destruction, even the strongest among them wept openly. Entire generations of nobility had been wiped out. Ancient lineages had ended with the war. The very social fabric that had held their world together had been torn beyond repair. The five brothers who had fought so long to reclaim their inheritance now found themselves rulers of a realm depleted of its finest men and richest families. The throne they had won was situated in a capital city filled with widows and orphans. Their victory felt more like punishment than reward, a bitter reminder that some prices are too high to pay, regardless of the justice of one's cause. Yet their sufferings were far from over. The true horror began 3 days after the formal end of hostilities, when most of the surviving fighters had departed for their homes or were resting in their camps, believing the war finally concluded. It was then that Ashwathama, son of the fallen weapons instructor, arrived at the camp of the victorious army under cover of darkness. Consumed by grief for his father's death and rage at the deception that had caused it, this young man had allied himself with the few remaining champions of the losing side. Together, they had conceived a plan of revenge so terrible that even hardened soldiers would have recoiled from it. They would attack the sleeping camp and slaughter everyone they found, making no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, between the guilty and the innocent. The midnight massacre that followed violated every principle of honorable warfare. Ashwatthama and his companions moved through the camp like demons, killing sleeping men who had no chance to defend themselves. They murdered servants and attendants who had never raised weapons in anger. Most horrifically, they slaughtered the 5 young sons of Draupadi, children who had played no part in the ancient quarrels that had consumed their elders. When morning came and the full scope of the atrocity became clear, even the gods themselves seemed to cry out in horror. The few survivors of the night attack brought word to the 5 brothers who had been staying elsewhere and thus escaped the massacre. The news struck them like physical blows. After surviving 18 days of the most terrible war in history, they had lost their children to a coward's attack in the supposed safety of their own camp. The pursuit of Ashwathama became a quest for justice that consumed the immediate aftermath of their victory. When they finally cornered him, the perpetrator of the massacre attempted to defend himself with a weapon of such devastating power that it threatened to destroy not just his enemies, but all life itself. Only the intervention of the sage Vyasa prevented a catastrophe that would have reduced the entire world to ashes. Instead of death, which would have been too merciful, Ashwatthama received a curse that ensured his punishment would last for eternity. The jewel that had adorned his forehead since birth, a mark of his divine heritage, was torn away, leaving a wound that would never heal. He was condemned to wander the earth until the end of time, bearing festering sores that would cause him constant agony, but never allow him the release of death. The curse satisfied the demands of justice, but brought no comfort to the bereaved parents. Their children remained dead, another price paid for a victory that seemed to demand sacrifice of everything they held dear. The princess Draupadi, who had endured so much and waited so long for vindication, found that revenge offered no solace for the loss of her sons. As if these tragedies were not sufficient, the immediate aftermath of the war brought yet another devastating revelation. In the confusion following the massacre, when emotions ran highest and grief demanded explanation, the truth about Karna's parentage finally emerged. The son-born champion, whom they had killed in honorable combat, was revealed to be their own eldest brother, the firstborn son of their mother Kunti, abandoned in infancy and raised by humble foster parents. The knowledge that they had unknowingly committed fratricide added a new dimension to their suffering. The archer who had loosed the fatal shaft was particularly devastated, realizing that his greatest rival had also been his closest blood relative. Their mother's confession that she had kept this secret for decades, fearing the complications it would cause, only deepened their anguish. The revelation cast a shadow over everything they had accomplished. If Karna's true parentage had been known, he would have been the rightful heir to the throne they had fought so hard to claim. His loyalty to their enemies, which had seemed like stubborn perversity, was revealed as the faithfulness of a man who had chosen gratitude over blood, honor over expedience. In death, he appeared more noble than any of them had imagined in life. But perhaps the most ominous development in these dark days was the appearance of Gandhari, mother of the 100 slain brothers, who came to the battlefield to perform the final rites for her sons. The queen, who had blindfolded herself in sympathy with her husband's condition, now moved through the carnage with supernatural perception, identifying each of her dead children by touch alone. When she encountered the 5 brothers who had survived to claim victory, her grief transformed into a curse that chilled the blood of all who heard it. Speaking with the authority of a mother's inconsolable loss, she declared that just as they had destroyed her lineage through treachery and violence, so too would their own descendants perish through internal strife. The Divine Prince's clan, which had supported them throughout their trials, would destroy itself in a fratricidal war that would leave none alive. The curse was all the more terrible because those who heard it recognized its justice. They had indeed violated many principles of honor in their quest for victory. They had used deception and cunning where straightforward combat had failed. They had allowed their desire for triumph to override their commitment to righteousness. And now they would pay the price for those compromises. The Divine Prince himself, who had served as guide and counselor throughout their struggle, accepted the curse with equanimity that spoke of his cosmic understanding. He knew that his own earthly mission was nearing its completion, and that the time had come for him to withdraw from the world of mortal affairs. His clan's destruction would be terrible, but necessary, part of the larger cycle of creation and dissolution that governed all existence. In the midst of these revelations and curses, the practical work of establishing a new government had to continue. The righteous king, despite his anguish over the costs of victory, accepted the crown that he had fought so long to claim. But his rule began under circumstances that would have daunted the most confident monarch: a depleted population, a devastated economy, and a nobility decimated by 18 days of unprecedented slaughter. The coronation ceremony itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the survivors. Instead of the joyous celebration that should have marked the restoration of legitimate rule, the ritual proceeded with the solemnity of a funeral. The new emperor accepted his crown, not as a prize won through heroic effort, but as a burden imposed by duty and dharma. Among his first acts was the performance of the Ashvamedha sacrifice, a ritual designed to establish his authority and restore cosmic order after the chaos of war. The ceremony required the release of a sacred horse that would wander freely for a full cycle, followed by royal champions who would challenge any ruler who dared to interfere with its passage. The successful completion of this ritual would demonstrate divine approval of the new reign and help heal the spiritual wounds left by the war. Yet even as they worked to rebuild their shattered world, the survivors could not escape the shadows cast by their recent experiences. The 5 brothers who had once been inseparable found their relationships strained by guilt and recrimination. Each blamed himself for different aspects of their tragedy, and each found it difficult to look at his siblings without remembering the prices they had all paid for their triumph. The Princess Draupadi, who had been the catalyst for so much of their suffering and the symbol of their determination to restore justice, withdrew into a grief that no amount of vindication could heal. The woman who had once moved through royal courts with confidence and grace now seemed aged beyond her seasons, marked by losses that would shadow the remainder of her life. The kingdom they had regained was a pale reflection of what it had been before the war. Where once great cities had bustled with commerce and learning, now there were empty spaces where entire families had been extinguished. Where once the finest warriors and wisest counselors had gathered to serve their rulers, now there were mostly graves and memories. And always, in the background of their consciousness, lay the knowledge that this devastation had been necessary, that the old order had become so corrupted that only complete destruction could clear the way for something better. The war had been fought not just for political power, but for the very soul of Dharma itself. And in that larger struggle, victory had required sacrifices that no human heart could contemplate without breaking. As the months passed, and the immediate crisis of establishing new governance subsided, the deeper questions raised by their experiences began to surface. Had their victory truly served the cause of righteousness, or had they merely replaced one flawed system with another? Could any throne be worth the price they had paid to claim it? And most troubling of all, what kind of world were they creating for the few children who had survived the general devastation? The divine prince, preparing for his own departure from mortal existence, offered what comfort he could to his traumatized friends. He reminded them that they had served as instruments of cosmic necessity, that their personal suffering was part of a larger pattern beyond human comprehension. But even his wisdom seemed inadequate to heal wounds that went so deep. The age that had begun with such promise, when 5 God-born brothers had married a fire-born princess and built a city that embodied the highest ideals of human civilization, was ending in sorrow and desolation. Yet within that ending lay the seeds of whatever age would follow, for the survivors carried with them hard-won wisdom about the true costs of power and the terrible complexity of righteousness in an imperfect world. The field of Kurukshetra, once witness to the greatest gathering of noble warriors in history, now stood silent except for the wind moving through the bones of the fallen. But the lessons learned there would echo through all subsequent ages, a reminder that even the most necessary victories can exact prices too terrible to bear, and that the greatest triumphs often taste most bitter to those who achieve them.